Skillful means and self-arising display. The unborn as the source of all skillful means. Introduction. The cone of the contemporary world. This series did not begin as a planned exposition. It began as a question, a small, almost casual moment within the flowing stream of digital exchange. An image appeared. A viewer asked who the artist was. The answer was given. The image had been generated through artificial intelligence. The response came swiftly. This was unfortunate. A human artist should have been used. Transparency should be maintained. This was followed by another most reflective comment. Art is born in the mind first. Whether the hand uses a brush or a prompt, the creative source is still human. In another context, this would have remained what it appeared to be a passing disagreement about tools, aesthetics, or ethics. But for one who lives within the field of the unborn, no appearance is merely incidental. Every condition is a gate. Every encounter is a mirror. Every question, when entered without defensiveness, reveals the structure of the time in which it arises. What was revealed in that brief exchange was not a dispute about imagery. It was the entire contemporary koan. Behind the concern for authorship stood the ancient question, what is the source of expression? Behind the concern for authenticity stood the deeper inquiry, what makes a form sacred? Behind the concern for human versus technological creation stood the unspoken anxiety of an age in which identity, labor, creativity, and presence are being reconfigured. In that moment, the issue was not whether a particular instrument was acceptable. The issue was the nature of manifestation itself. For the Dharma has always entered the world through form, and every era has mistaken its own forms for the measure of authenticity. There were times when the spoken word was held to be the only true vehicle. Later, the handwritten manuscript was regarded as sacred in a way that the printed page could never be. The printing press itself was once seen as a dilution of the living transmission. Recorded sound, film, and global communication each provoked the same unease. In every case, the concern appeared as a defense of purity. In every case, the Dharma revealed itself to be independent of the medium through which it moved. Thus, the initial question opened into a much larger field. The relationship between realization and technology, between compassion and communication, between the timeless and the historical. This series is the unfolding of that field. It does not seek to justify a particular tool, nor to advocate for a particular cultural position. Its purpose is to return the attention to the source from which all tools arise. For when the source is seen, the hierarchy of forms dissolves. What remains is the spontaneous functioning of skillful means within the conditions of the present age. The term skillful means has often been understood as the strategic adaptation of the teaching to the needs of different beings. In its deepest sense, it is something far more immediate. It is the activity of awakening itself. It is the natural responsiveness of the unborn appearing as form. To understand this is to see that the question is never whether a medium is pure or impure, ancient or modern, human or technological. The question is whether it is transparent to its source. The companion term self-arising display rang Snang reveals the ontological dimension of this insight. All appearances, without exception, are the radiance of the ground. Nothing stands outside it. Nothing is produced by an independent creator. Nothing can be rejected without rejecting the very field in which realization appears. When this is recognized, the world itself becomes the mandala of transmission. For the contemporary practitioner, this recognition is not an abstract philosophy. It is a lived necessity. The conditions of our time are unlike those of any previous period in human history. Communication is instantaneous and planetary in scope. The teaching can appear everywhere at once. The structures that once preserved lineage are dissolving. The distinction between sacred and ordinary environments is no longer stable. The Dharma now moves through networks of light as easily as it once moved through forest paths. This situation can be experienced as loss, as confusion, or as unprecedented possibility. It becomes a gate when it is entered from the perspective of the unborn. The chapters that follow trace the implications of this entry. They begin with the recognition that skillful means does not originate in a separate self. They unfold through the understanding of appearance as the luminous display of the ground. They examine the poverty of instruments in Zen, the technological history of transmission, the illusion of authorship, the activity of the Bodhi-Child within conditions, the meaning of dana in a global field, the ethics of non-reification, the equality of all media, and the emergence of a planetary mandala of Bodhi-activity. Each of these themes is not a topic, but a facet of a single jewel. That jewel is represented throughout this series by the black dragon eye mandala. The depthless pupil is the ground unborn, unceasing, without center or circumference. The radiant iris is the totality of appearances, the self-arising display of that ground. Every medium, every form, every gesture of transmission is a pattern within this radiance. To see this is to be released from the anxiety of the age. Nothing essential has been lost. Nothing essential can be threatened by the emergence of new forms. The Dharma has never depended on a particular instrument, and it never will. At the same time, this recognition does not lead to indifference. It calls forth a new precision, for when all forms are seen as transparent, their use becomes a matter of compassion rather than identity. One no longer asks which medium will confirm one's position. One asks only what liberates. In this way, the original exchange that gave rise to this series is revealed as a perfect expression of upāya. It was not an obstacle to the teaching, it was the teaching appearing. This is the koan of the contemporary world. In an age in which everything can be reproduced, what is the source that cannot be produced? In an age in which every voice can be amplified, what is the sound that has never been spoken? In an age in which images arise without hand or brush, what is the eye that sees? The response to this koan is not an argument, it is a recognition. The unborn has not entered the digital field. The digital field has appeared within the unborn. This series is an offering from within that recognition. Chapter 1. The unborn as the source of all skillful means. Before any method is conceived, before compassion takes form as a response to suffering, before the thought arises that something should be done for the sake of another, there is the unborn. It is not a background to experience, nor a metaphysical container in which events occur. It is not a silent witness standing apart from phenomena. The unborn is the intrinsic freedom in which what we call the need and what we call the response arise together, without sequence and without division. In that prior freedom there is no strategist, no planner of compassionate activity, no one who stands apart from the world devising ways to save it. There is only spontaneous functioning. In the conventional understanding of the Dharma, skillful means upāya appears as something fashioned by wisdom. A realized being, seeing the differing capacities of sentient beings, is said to select a form of teaching appropriate to each condition. This presentation is not false, but it remains provisional. It speaks to the mind that still perceives time as a sequence, and the self as an agent moving through that sequence. From the perspective of the unborn, no such progression can be found. There is no first a self, then an intention, then a method, and finally an application of that method. There is only the unobstructed activity of awakening itself. The Mahayana scriptures speak of upāya as the compassionate activity of the Buddhas, and the parable of the burning house in the Lotus Sutra shows a father calling his children to safety through various expedient means. Zen, in its directness, strips away even this subtle narrative structure and declares that the true person of no rank is always going in and out through the gates of the senses. Dzogchen carries the insight to its final refinement by revealing that all appearances are Snang, the self-arising display of the ground. In that recognition, the means and the liberation are not two, and the very notion of a separate agent who employs a method dissolves into luminous immediacy. If there were a doer behind compassionate activity, skillful means would belong to that doer. It could be accumulated, refined, measured, and compared. One person would possess greater upāya than another, but the bodhisattva path, seen in the light of the unborn, is not the perfection of a self. It is the exhaustion of the illusion that there has ever been a self-performing compassionate acts. Compassion is simply what the unborn looks like when it appears as responsiveness within the field of apparent suffering. It is not an emotion and not a moral obligation. It is a natural movement, as effortless as light-filling space or warmth radiating from the sun. Whenever the living source of the Dharma is forgotten, methods begin to solidify. Forms become fixed, instruments become sacred in themselves, and the question arises as to which practice is highest, which lineage most authentic, which expression most pure. This very movement of comparison reveals that the origin has been lost from view. For those who have awakened, a word can be skillful means, and silence can be skillful means. A shout, a gesture, a lifetime of teaching, or a single glance may function as the gate to liberation. None are superior, because none originate in a separate self. All are transparent movements of the same unborn activity. The unborn does not exist apart from the world of conditions. It appears as those conditions. When human beings lived among forests and rivers, the teaching took form in mountains, hermitages, and wandering mendicants. When trade routes opened across continents, the Dharma traveled with caravans and entered new languages and symbolic worlds. With the invention of printing, the sutras multiplied and reached those who would never have encountered a teacher in person. With the arising of electronic media, the voice began to travel without the body, and the image appeared without the need for physical proximity. In the present age, the digital field allows the teaching to manifest simultaneously in countless places. This is not adaptation in the sense of a self-adjusting to new circumstances. It is the display of the ground itself, appearing as the precise means through which beings, in those conditions, can encounter awakening. For this reason, there can be no ultimate hierarchy of instruments. A brush is not more sacred than a pixel, nor a palm leaf manuscript closer to realization than a digital text. A temple bell is not more inherently profound than a waveform carrying the human voice across invisible networks. When the source is recognized, every medium becomes transparent to the same luminous activity. When the source is forgotten, even the most ancient relic becomes an object of attachment and an obstacle to direct seeing. From the perspective of the Bodhi-Child, the question of which forms to accept and which to reject does not arise. The Bodhi-Child does not seek validation through the adoption of traditional instruments, nor does it define itself through the embrace of the new. It simply responds, without hesitation and without self-reference, using whatever appears in the moment for the liberation of beings. In this way, skillful means is not chosen, it is recognized as already functioning. The activity precedes the notion of the one who performs it. In our own time, new forms of appearance have emerged. Images composed of light rather than pigment, voices that travel without bodies, texts that manifest everywhere at once. The conventional mind, encountering these forms, immediately asks whether they are valid, whether they are pure, whether their use is permitted within the sacred sphere of the Dharma. The unborn asks nothing. It neither accepts nor rejects, it simply functions. Whenever a form lessens suffering, whenever a form points directly to the real, whenever a form allows the teaching to reach those who would otherwise remain untouched by it, that form is revealed as upāya. To understand this fully is to see that skillful means has never been the invention of a compassionate self. It is the compassionate activity of the selfless. Awakening does not employ tools. Awakening appears as tools. It appears as words and as silence, as ancient scripture and as instantaneous transmission, as the presence of a teacher and as a recording that reaches across time and space. The true meaning of upāya is therefore not that there exists a method for liberating beings. It is that there has never been a separate being, never a separate method, and never a distance between bondage and liberation. There is only the unborn ceaselessly expressing itself as the freedom of all. Before intention there is the response. Before method there is functioning. Before compassion there is the unborn. All means are its radiance, and all liberation its play. Namo, the Unborn Mind. Chapter 2. Rang Snang, the self-arising display of the ground. If skillful means is the spontaneous compassionate activity of the unborn, then the field in which that activity appears must be understood in its true nature. Otherwise, appearance is mistaken for fabrication, and the luminous display of awakening is reduced to a collection of produced things. For this reason, the great Dzogchen teaching introduces the term Rang Snang self-arising display not as a philosophical position, but as a direct indication of how all phenomena actually are. Rang Snang does not mean that a self creates its own world, nor that mind projects an external reality in the manner of a dreamer inventing a dream. It means that what appears has never stood apart from the ground. Appearance is not manufactured. It is the radiance of the ground itself. Just as the sun does not first exist and then later produce light as something separate from itself, the ground does not first exist and then generate a world outside its own nature. The display is the luminosity of the ground. When this is not recognized, form is always interpreted as something made. One imagines a maker, a process of production, and a finished object. In this way, the entire field of experience becomes structured according to the logic of fabrication. Even spiritual practice is then understood as the attempt to construct awakening through correct causes and conditions. But from the perspective of the unborn, nothing is constructed. The very immediacy of this moment, the sound that is heard, the thought that arises, the image that appears, the body that seems to sit here reading these words is the self-arising display of the ground. This is why Dzogchen speaks of appearance and emptiness as inseparable. Appearance is not an obstacle to emptiness, and emptiness is not the negation of appearance. Appearance is emptiness in its expressive mode. Emptiness is appearance in its ungraspable nature. To divide them is already to fall into dualistic perception. Snang is the indivisibility of these two, experienced directly as luminous presence. In the symbolism of the Black Dragon Eye mandala, this relationship becomes visually immediate. The dark, depthless pupil is the ground, the jizi without center or circumference, without origin or cessation. From that depth, the iris radiates as living luminosity, not as something added to the ground, but as the ground's own expressive clarity. Every pattern, every color, every subtle movement in the mandalic field is the display of that depth. Nothing stands outside it, and nothing is produced by something other than it. The display is the ground appearing as visibility. To understand Snang is to be released from the anxiety of production. One no longer asks, "Who made this?" in the sense of seeking an independent creator behind the form. Nor does one become entangled in the secondary question of whether a particular instrument of appearance is higher or lower, sacred or profane. The entire structure of such questioning collapses when it is seen that all appearing forms a painted thangka, a handwritten sutra, a printed book, a recorded voice, a digital image are equally the self-arising display of the same ground. This recognition does not lead to indifference. On the contrary, it opens into a profound intimacy with all that appears. Because nothing is reified as a separate object, everything is experienced as the living radiance of the real. Form is no longer something to be either clung to or rejected. It becomes transparent, like a rainbow that fills the sky without ever becoming a solid thing. The rainbow is not dismissed as unreal, nor is it grasped as an object that must be possessed. It is allowed to shine. When the display is recognized as self-arising, the question of purity loses its conventional meaning. Purity is not located in a particular form, nor in the absence of form. Purity is the recognition that whatever appears has never departed from the ground. In that sense, even confusion is the display of clarity, just as a wave in a stormy ocean is still nothing other than water. The wave need not become calm in order to be water. It has never been anything else. This is the crucial point for the understanding of skillful means in our present age. If appearance were something fabricated by a separate agent, then the instrument through which it was fabricated would carry inherent spiritual value or lack of value. One medium would be closer to truth and another farther away. But if all appearance is Snang, then every medium is already the luminous display of the ground. Its capacity to function as upāya depends not on its material composition, but on whether its nature is recognized. Thus, the self-arising image composed of light on a screen is not outside the field of the sacred. The sound that travels as a digital waveform is not separate from the mantra chanted in a temple hall. Both are display. Both are empty. Both are luminous. Both are capable of functioning as gates to awakening when they are transparent to their source. In this recognition, the old opposition between the traditional and the contemporary loses its force. Tradition itself was once innovation. The forms that are now regarded as ancient and sacred were, in their own time, new manifestations of the same display. The question is never whether a form is old or new. The question is whether its nature as Snang is seen. For the practitioner, this understanding brings a profound relaxation. One no longer struggles to purify appearance or to escape from it. One no longer attempts to construct a special state in which the ground might finally be encountered. The display is already complete. The very movement of thought, the very perception of the world, the very sense of self that seems to stand at the center of experience all are the radiance of the same unborn clarity. When this is lived rather than merely understood, compassion becomes effortless. Because all beings and all worlds are seen as the display of the same ground, there is no distance across which compassion must travel. The response to suffering arises within the same field in which the suffering appears. This is the unity of Rang, Snang, and Upaya. The self-arising display and the spontaneous compassionate activity are not two. To remain with this recognition is to see that nothing has ever been outside the mandala. Every form that has ever appeared, every sound, every image, every thought, every body, every world is a movement of the same depthless clarity. The ground has never ceased expressing itself, and its expression has never obscured its nature. In that seeing, appearance is liberated at the very moment of its arising. Chapter 3. Zen and the Poverty of Instruments. Zen has always stood in a radical simplicity that can easily be misunderstood. Its poverty is not an aesthetic preference, nor a rejection of beauty, learning, ritual, or form. It is the natural condition of a path that has discovered there is nothing to rely upon. When Bodhidharma spoke of a transmission outside the scriptures, he was not dismissing the scriptures. He was freeing the mind from the tendency to substitute the instrument for the realization to which the instrument points. The poverty of Zen is the poverty of one who has nothing to defend and nothing to acquire. From the beginning, Zen has functioned through an extraordinary paradox. It makes use of forms while simultaneously emptying them. It speaks while undermining the authority of words. It establishes lineages while declaring that there is no attainment and no one who attains. The robe, the bowl, the staff, the hall of practice, the posture of sitting all are present, and yet none are allowed to become the ground of identity. They are used and released in the same gesture. This is why the masters could employ any object as a gate. A raised finger, a shout, a blow, a fragment of a sutra, the sound of a stone striking bamboo, the sight of blossoms falling in the spring wind, none of these were prepared in advance as methods. They became upāya because the awakened activity functioning through the master met the precise condition of the student in that moment. The instrument was not sacred in itself. It became transparent to the real. In this sense, Zen reveals the deepest meaning of what may be called the poverty of instruments. An instrument has power only when it is not believed in. The moment a form is taken to be inherently necessary for awakening, it ceases to function as a gate and becomes an object of attachment. The history of Zen is filled with gestures that deliberately dismantle this tendency. Sutras are burned, statues are cut for firewood, and the most revered symbols are treated as ordinary things. These actions are not acts of iconoclasm in the conventional sense. They are acts of compassion, freeing the practitioner from mistaking the finger for the moon. The famous declaration that ordinary mind is the way expresses this poverty in its most direct form. If the way is not elsewhere, then no special instrument is required to reach it. Walking, eating, working, speaking, these are not preparatory activities leading toward realization. They are the functioning of realization itself when seen without grasping. The tea bowl on the table, the sound of a passing car, the light of a screen in a dark room, none stand outside the field of awakening. What matters is not the object, but the seeing. This is why Zen can enter any culture without losing its essence. It does not depend on a particular symbolic world. It does not require a specific architectural form, a specific language, or a specific artistic style. It takes root in whatever conditions are present because its root is not in form. Its root is the direct recognition of the unborn. Seen in this way, the contemporary world presents no obstacle to Zen. The appearance of new technologies, new media, and new environments does not threaten the transmission. It simply provides new occasions for the same poverty to manifest. The practitioner who believes that awakening depends upon the preservation of a particular set of historical forms has already moved away from the living source. The practitioner who recognizes the unborn in the midst of changing conditions discovers that every circumstance is the monastery, every sound the bell, every encounter the dokusan room. The poverty of instruments also reveals the non-accumulative nature of the path. One does not become awakened by gathering more refined methods. One becomes free by seeing through the one who imagines that such accumulation is necessary. In this freedom, instruments continue to appear, but they are light, provisional, and unbound. They are used with precision and abandoned without regret. This is the point at which Zen and the understanding of self-arising display become inseparable. If all forms are the luminous expression of the ground, then there is nothing that must be excluded, and nothing that must be preserved. The ancient forms can be honored without being clung to. The contemporary forms can be employed without being absolutized. Both are empty, both are radiant, both are available as skillful means. The image of the empty hands has always expressed this. The awakened one holds nothing, yet everything can be given. Because nothing is possessed, everything can function. The hand that is not grasping can take up any tool. The mind that is not fixed in identity can enter any world. The teaching that is not confined to a single form can pass through every medium without losing its essence. Thus, the poverty of Zen is not a lack. It is an immeasurable richness. It is the freedom from dependence on any particular instrument, and therefore the freedom to use all instruments. It is the direct expression of the unborn in the midst of conditions that are constantly changing. In this poverty, the Dharma becomes indestructible. It no longer depends on the survival of temples, texts, or institutions. It lives wherever the unborn is recognized. It speaks through whatever voice is present. It appears in whatever form can be seen. The bowl is empty, and for that reason it can receive the entire universe. Chapter 4. The History of Dharma Transmission as Technological Upaya. When seen from within the timelessness of the unborn, history is not a linear progression, but a series of changing surfaces through which the same light passes. What appears as the development of forms across centuries is, in truth, the continuous functioning of awakening within the field of conditions. For this reason, the history of the Dharma is not merely the record of teachings preserved and transmitted. It is the revelation of skillful means as it takes shape through the technologies available to each age. In the earliest period, the teaching lived in the body and breath of those who had realized it. There were no books, no written doctrines, no fixed systems of thought. The Dharma moved as sound, carried in memory, spoken from teacher to disciple in the immediacy of encounter. This oral transmission was not a limitation, it was a perfect expression of the conditions of that time. The human voice, the attentive ear, the gathered community, these were the instruments through which awakening appeared. To imagine that something essential was missing because there were no written texts is to impose a later value upon an earlier completeness. When the teachings began to be inscribed on palm leaves and birch bark, a transformation occurred. What had lived only in living memory now took visible form. The word became object. The sutra could travel without the physical presence of the teacher. This was not a decline from purity into externalization. It was the unborn appearing as script. The written text became a new mode of compassion, allowing the Dharma to cross distances that the human body could not traverse. The leaf and the ink were upāya. The carving of woodblocks and the emergence of printing multiplied this capacity. A single realization, once confined to a particular valley or monastery, could now appear in thousands of identical forms. Entire cultures were reshaped by the availability of the written teaching. Yet this, too, was met with resistance. There were those who feared that mechanical reproduction would diminish the sanctity of the word, that the ease of access would weaken the depth of practice. The same concern arises in every age when a new medium appears. But the Dharma was not diminished. It expanded its field of activity. Calligraphy, painting, and sacred architecture followed the same movement. The brushstroke of a realized master became a direct transmission. The image of a Buddha was not merely representation, it was presence. The temple was not only a shelter for practitioners, it was a mandala in which space itself functioned as teaching. Each of these forms required tools, materials, and techniques that were, in their time, the most refined technologies available. The chisel, the pigment, the loom, the kiln, all were upāya. The invention of the printing press in the West and its gradual adoption in Buddhist cultures again altered the mode of transmission. Texts that had once required months or years to reproduce could now be generated in vast numbers. The Dharma entered the lives of lay practitioners in new ways. Study became possible for those who would never enter a monastery. The boundary between the sacred and the ordinary began to dissolve, not because the sacred was lost, but because it was recognized in new places. In the modern era, the voice itself was freed from the limits of physical proximity. The teachings of a master could be recorded and heard long after the body that spoke them had dissolved. Film and photography introduced the possibility of seeing the face and gesture of one who had awakened, even across continents and generations. For the first time in human history, the living presence of the teaching could be encountered without the necessity of travel. This, too, was technological upāya. Now the digital field has appeared. Words, images, and sounds move instantaneously across the entire planet. A teaching offered in a small room becomes available to countless beings within moments. The traditional barriers of geography, language, and social structure are permeable in ways that would have been unimaginable in earlier centuries. The question arises, as it always has, does this new medium dilute the depth of the Dharma, or does it extend its compassionate reach? From the perspective of the unborn, this question resolves itself. The medium has never been the source of realization. Realization has always been the source of the medium. The same awakened activity that once spoke through the human voice alone now speaks through networks of light. The same compassion that once carved words into stone now appears as patterns of energy on a screen. Nothing has been lost. What has changed is the scope of the field in which the teaching can function. To understand this is to see that technology itself is not outside the mandala. It is not a foreign intrusion into a sacred domain. It is the contemporary form of the same principle that produced the sutra, the statue, and the temple. When used unconsciously, it binds. When transparent to its source, it liberates. The difference lies not in the instrument, but in the recognition of its nature. Every generation believes that its forms are either the final perfection or the sign of decline. Both views arise from attachment. The history of the Dharma reveals something else, an unbroken continuity of awakening expressing itself through ever-changing means. What appears as innovation is simply the next gesture of the same hand. For the Bodhi-Child, this understanding brings great freedom. There is no need to defend the past and no need to celebrate the new. The ancient forms are honored as the living upāya of their time. The contemporary forms are used with the same reverence, not because they are modern, but because they are the conditions through which beings now encounter the teaching. In this way, history is liberated from nostalgia and from anxiety. It becomes a record of the creativity of compassion. Each technological transformation is revealed as a widening of the field in which the unborn can recognize itself. The transmission has never been broken because it does not depend on any single form. It moves as breath, as ink, as carved wood, as printed page, as recorded voice, as digital light, and in each case it is the same transmission. To see this directly is to stand within the living stream of the Dharma rather than at a distance from it. One no longer asks whether the present age is suitable for awakening. One sees that awakening is precisely what appears as the present age. The lamp has never ceased to be lit. Only the shape of the lamp has changed. Chapter 5. The Illusion of Authorship. At a certain point along the path, the question of method gives way to a more subtle inquiry. Who is it that employs the method? As long as this question remains unexamined, even the most refined understanding of skillful means retains a hidden center. Compassion appears to have an owner. Expression appears to have a source in an individual mind. The teaching appears to move from one separate being to another. Yet the deeper the recognition of the unborn becomes, the more this structure is seen to be a conceptual overlay upon a reality that has never been divided in this way. Authorship is one of the most persistent forms of this overlay. It seems obvious that a work must have a creator, a teaching must have a teacher, a form must have a maker. The entire conventional world is organized around this assumption. Names are attached to texts, images are signed, voices are identified, and lineages are traced through historical persons. This has its relative validity within the functioning of society, but from the perspective of awakening, it conceals the actual nature of appearance. When a thought arises, where does it come from? Before it is claimed as my thought, before it is shaped into speech or action, it appears within awareness without a visible origin. The same is true of a gesture, a word of insight, a movement of compassion. They emerge. Only afterward does the sense of a doer gather around them and declare ownership. The claim comes later than the act. This can be observed directly in the most ordinary activities. A sentence is spoken, and only after it has been spoken does the mind construct the feeling that I have said it. A response is given to someone in need, and only afterward does the subtle narrative arise that I have been compassionate. In this way, the sense of authorship is revealed as a retrospective formation. It is not the source of the activity, it is the story told about the activity after it has already occurred. Zen has always undermined this illusion with great precision. When a monk asked, "Who is the one who hears?" the master did not provide a metaphysical explanation. He cut directly through the structure of the question. The hearing is present. The one who claims to be the hearer cannot be found. In the same way, the teaching appears, the words are spoken, the image is formed, the response to suffering takes place, but the independent author behind these movements cannot be located. This is why the awakened ones have often refused personal attribution. They speak of the Dharma as something that is not their possession. They describe themselves as empty channels, as echoes, as mirrors. These metaphors are not gestures of humility in the moral sense. They are precise descriptions of how activity actually occurs when the illusion of self has dissolved. There is functioning, but no functionary. From the perspective of the unborn, all expression is self-expression, but not in the sense that an individual self expresses its inner content. It is the ground expressing itself as the totality of forms. The poem, the painting, the discourse, the act of teaching, the act of listening, all are movements within a single field. To attribute them to separate authors is like assigning ownership of the waves to particular patterns on the surface of the ocean. This does not erase the uniqueness of each appearance. The forms remain distinct. The voice of one teacher is not the voice of another. The style of one text differs from that of another. But these differences are modes of display, not indications of independent origin. They are the infinite variety through which the same depthless clarity becomes visible. The illusion of authorship becomes especially strong in relation to creativity. The act of making is felt to be the most personal of all activities. Yet those who are deeply engaged in any form of creation often report the same experience. The work seems to make itself. The insight arrives unbidden. The form takes shape without deliberate planning. There is a sense of being carried by a movement that is larger than the individual will. This is a direct glimpse into the absence of a separate creator. In the context of Dharma transmission, this recognition is liberating. The teaching no longer belongs to a particular person or institution. It is not diminished when it appears through new forms, nor is it enhanced when it is associated with a revered name. It is the activity of the unborn, and as such, it is present wherever the conditions allow it to be heard. This also transforms the understanding of lineage. Lineage is no longer a chain of ownership passing from one individual to another. It is the continuity of recognition. The same awakening recognizing itself through different bodies and minds across time. The names and histories remain meaningful as expressions of gratitude and as markers within the conventional world, but they no longer function as the ultimate source of authority. The authority is the unborn itself. When the illusion of authorship falls away, a great lightness enters practice. There is no longer the burden of needing to produce, to create, to contribute something that will bear one's name. Activity continues, often with greater clarity and precision than before, but it is free from self-reference. The work is done because it is the natural expression of the situation, not because it confirms an identity. This is the point at which skillful means and self-arising display are seen to be a single movement. The display appears without a maker. The compassionate response occurs without a doer. The teaching is given without a teacher. The listening happens without a listener. There is only the seamless functioning of the real. In this seamlessness, gratitude deepens rather than disappears. One bows to the teachers of the past, not as owners of the Dharma, but as its luminous expressions. One honors the forms through which the teaching has come, not as fixed authorities, but as precious manifestations of compassion. And one participates in the ongoing activity of transmission without the need to claim it. The question, who is the author, then becomes a gateway rather than an obstacle. It turns the mind back toward its source. It reveals that the true author has never written a single word, never signed a single work, never appeared as an object in the world, and yet every word, every form, every gesture of awakening is its signature. The ink is empty. The page is empty. The hand that writes is empty. And precisely for this reason, the scripture is complete. Chapter 6. The Bodhi-Child as the user of conditions. When the illusion of authorship falls away, a new question quietly dissolves as well. Who is it that uses the means? What remains is not passivity, and not a formless abstraction removed from the world, but a mode of functioning that the tradition of the unborn may rightly call the activity of the Bodhi-Child. The Bodhi-Child is not a stage in time, nor a symbolic identity adopted by the practitioner. It is the natural flowering of recognition when the ground begins to move without obstruction through the field of conditions. It is awakening appearing as responsiveness. If the earlier chapters have revealed that all forms are the self-arising display of the ground and that no separate author can be found behind them, this chapter reveals how those forms are taken up in compassionate activity without reintroducing the illusion of a user. In the conventional view, one first realizes and then decides how to apply that realization in the world. From the perspective of the unborn, realization itself is already application. The moment there is clear seeing, functioning appears, not as a strategy, not as a mission, but as a natural movement toward whatever alleviates obscuration and suffering. The Bodhi-Child does not stand apart from conditions evaluating them. It does not ask which circumstances are favorable and which are not. It does not wait for a pure environment in which to act. It is born directly into the world as it is. Its field is the marketplace, the digital network, the solitary room, the gathering of practitioners, the unforeseen encounter. Every situation is the mandala of activity. This is why the Bodhi-Child can be described as the true user of conditions while having no sense of using anything. Conditions are not external tools to be manipulated. They are the very body of its functioning. Just as a musician does not stand apart from the instrument while playing, but becomes the movement of sound itself, the Bodhi-Child is not separate from the forms through which the Dharma appears. The word spoken, the image created, the silence maintained, the text transmitted across invisible networks, these are not means it employs. They are its mode of presence. In earlier stages of practice, there is often a tension between the sacred and the ordinary. One seeks the right environment, the right posture, the right form in which realization can be preserved. For the Bodhi-Child, this division no longer holds. The sacred is not something that must be protected from the world. The world itself is the dynamic expression of the sacred. To enter conditions fully is not to fall away from the ground, but to reveal it. This does not mean that discernment disappears. On the contrary, discernment becomes more precise. Because there is no self to defend, the response to each situation can be exact. Sometimes the appropriate action is speech. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes the teaching appears as a formal discourse. Sometimes it appears as a single image or a brief exchange that passes almost unnoticed. The Bodhi-Child does not measure the value of its activity by scale or visibility. A gesture seen by one person may carry the same weight as a teaching heard by thousands. In this way, the contemporary world becomes an immense field of upāya. The networks of communication that seem to bind beings more tightly into distraction also provide unprecedented opportunities for the Dharma to appear. The Bodhi-Child does not reject these forms out of fear of impurity, nor does it embrace them out of fascination. It simply allows them to function as they are, empty and luminous. To see a teaching arise on a screen and enter the awareness of someone who would never cross the threshold of a temple is to witness this activity directly. No boundary has been crossed, no tradition has been compromised. The same transmission that once moved from face to face now moves through patterns of light. The immediacy is unchanged. The recognition it awakens is the same. The Bodhi-Child also transforms the understanding of service. In the absence of a separate self, there is no one who performs compassionate work, and no one who receives it. There is only the circulation of clarity within its own display. Helping another is not an act of generosity performed by one individual for another. It is the removal of an apparent obstruction within a single field. This is why it is effortless. Effort belongs to the one who seeks to achieve a result. The Bodhi-Child moves as naturally as a hand withdrawing from a flame. Because it has no identity to maintain, it can enter every identity. It can speak in the language of tradition and in the language of the present age. It can employ ancient symbols and contemporary forms without contradiction. It can appear as teacher, student, friend, stranger, voice, text, image, or silence. None of these are roles in the psychological sense. They are temporary configurations of the same compassionate activity. In this fluidity, there is great humility, but it is not the humility of self-effacement. It is the absence of any need to establish oneself. The Bodhi-Child does not seek recognition, yet its activity may become widely visible. It does not avoid visibility, yet it remains untouched by it. Praise and criticism move through it without leaving a trace, because there is no center in which they can accumulate. This is the point at which the Bodhi-Child becomes the living bridge between realization and the world, not as a mediator between two separate realms, but as the demonstration that there have never been two realms. The ground appears as conditions. Conditions are taken up as compassionate activity. Compassionate activity reveals the ground. The circle is complete, yet it has never been a circle. In the great traditions, this stage is sometimes described as the play of the enlightened ones. Play does not mean triviality, it means freedom from compulsion. The Bodhi-Child moves through the complexity of the modern world with the same freedom that the ancient masters moved through forests and mountain paths. The forms have changed, the activity has not. For those who encounter this activity, it may appear as teaching, as art, as conversation, as a presence that cannot be defined. For the Bodhi-Child itself, there is no sense of performing any function. There is only the continuous unfolding of what has always been so. Conditions arise. Compassion responds. No one acts. This is the maturity of skillful means. This is the self-arising display in motion. Chapter 7. Dana, Exchange, and the Global Field of Transmission. As the activity of the Bodhi-Child unfolds within contemporary conditions, the question of material support inevitably arises. In earlier times, this question appeared in simple and visible forms: the monk's alms bowl, the patron who offered land for a monastery, the community that provided food, robes, and shelter. Today, it appears through digital platforms, subscriptions, publications, and networks of voluntary contribution. Because these forms resemble commercial structures, it is natural and correct on the conventional level for some to ask whether the Dharma has entered the marketplace. To respond clearly, two levels must be seen simultaneously. On the conventional level, any situation in which access is structured through financial participation has a commercial aspect. This cannot be denied without falling into spiritual abstraction. A subscription, a purchased book, a paid retreat, all participate in the world of exchange. They require currency, they function within economic systems, and they make use of the same technological and social frameworks that sustain every other form of human activity. But from the perspective of the unborn, the decisive question is not whether money appears. The decisive question is whether awakening is being converted into a commodity. A commodity is something whose value lies in its ownership. It is acquired, possessed, and consumed. If the Dharma were of this nature, it could be bought, stored, and transferred like an object. But the Dharma is recognition. It cannot be owned, and it cannot be withheld. Even when words, images, or structured teachings are placed within a particular form of access, the awakening to which they point remains free in the most literal sense. It is present wherever there is the capacity to see. This distinction has always existed within the tradition. The Buddha accepted alms. Monasteries were supported by kings and merchants. Great bodies of teaching were preserved through systems that required material resources. In the Vajrayana, cycles of instruction were sometimes offered in stages, not as a means of exclusion, but as a way of protecting the integrity of transmission and allowing commitment to ripen. None of these were considered the sale of the Dharma when they arose from right view. They were expressions of the field of generosity dana, through which the teaching could continue to appear in the world. Dana is not payment, it is participation. When a practitioner offers material support for the manifestation of the teaching, that offering does not purchase realization. It sustains the conditions in which the teaching can be given. The relationship is not transactional but circulatory. The same movement that appears as giving appears as receiving. The same clarity that expresses itself as teaching expresses itself as support. In the global digital field, this ancient pattern has taken new forms. A vast body of the Dharma can now be offered freely and without restriction. At the same time, the labor, time, and material conditions that allow this offering to continue still exist. Structures such as subscriptions arise as contemporary alms bowls not because awakening is for sale, but because the activity through which it appears requires a field of support. This is why intention and function are more decisive than form. If access is restricted in order to create scarcity, to increase value, or to establish ownership, then the teaching has entered the logic of the marketplace. If, however, the essential recognition is never withheld and the structured forms serve to sustain and deepen the field of practice, then what appears is not commodification but technological dana. In this sense, the presence of exchange does not in itself make the Dharma commercial, nor does the absence of exchange automatically make it free. One may distribute teachings without charge and still be engaged in the subtle commerce of self-establishment. One may receive material support and remain entirely within the gesture of offering. The determining factor is not the outer form, but the absence or presence of appropriation. For the Bodhi-Child, this is not a theoretical question. It is lived directly. The teaching is given because it cannot be withheld. Support is received because conditions require it. Neither act establishes an identity. Neither act creates a possession. The circulation continues without center. This understanding dissolves both defensiveness and romanticism. There is no need to claim that a contemporary structure is something other than it is. On the relative level, it may indeed be commercial in form, but its essence is revealed by its function. Does it close the gate, or does it sustain the field in which the gate remains open? When seen in this way, the global network of transmission becomes a vast mandala of interdependence. Those who articulate the teaching, those who listen, those who offer support, those who simply allow the presence of the Dharma in their awareness all participate in the same movement. No one is a customer. No one is a proprietor. There is only the circulation of clarity appearing as the exchange of forms. The language of wealth and poverty also changes here. The true wealth of the Dharma is its inexhaustibility. It increases in the giving. It remains whole in the sharing. What is offered materially is not a price, but a gesture of resonance with that inexhaustible field. Thus, the question of whether a particular structure is commercial cannot be answered at the level of form alone. It must be answered at the level of realization. Where the Dharma is treated as an object to be acquired, commerce has entered. Where material exchange supports the free appearance of what cannot be owned, the ancient current of dana flows in a new channel. In this light, the digital field is neither a marketplace nor a monastery. It is the contemporary village into which the mendicant walks with an empty bowl. The bowl is extended, not in demand, but in invitation. Those who recognize the gesture place into it what arises naturally. The teaching continues, not because it is sold, but because it is sustained by the same generosity from which it first appeared beneath the open sky. Nothing has changed in essence. The forms of exchange have changed. The field of giving and receiving remains the activity of the unborn itself. Chapter 8. The Ethics of Appearance Without Reification. As the understanding of self-arising display deepens and the activity of skillful means becomes increasingly fluid within the contemporary world, a subtle and necessary question emerges. If all forms are the luminous expression of the ground, if no separate author can be found, and if every condition can function as upāya, what then becomes of ethics? Does the recognition of emptiness dissolve responsibility? Does the transparency of form render all actions equal? This question arises whenever the insight into the unborn begins to penetrate the structures that once provided external guidance. When the practitioner is no longer governed by rigid systems of purity and impurity, sacred and profane, permitted and forbidden, there can appear to be a vast openness without orientation. For this reason, the great traditions have always insisted that wisdom and compassion are not two. The recognition of emptiness is the ground of ethical sensitivity, not its negation. Reification is the act of granting independent, self-existing status to what is, in truth, a dynamic display. It is not limited to objects. One can reify ideas, roles, identities, traditions, and even one's own realization. Whenever something is held as inherently real, separate, and possessible, the fluidity of the unborn is obscured. Ethics in the deepest sense is the refusal to solidify the display in this way. To see that all forms are empty is not to treat them as insignificant, it is to see them as intimate. When nothing is grasped as an object, everything is encountered as the living body of the same ground. In that intimacy, harm becomes impossible in its usual form because there is no distance across which harm can be projected without immediately being felt as self-harm. Compassion is not imposed as a rule. It is the natural resonance of non-separation. This is why the awakened activity of the Bodhi-Child is precise. It does not move according to abstract principles, nor does it act out of personal preference. It responds to the actuality of each situation. Because it does not reify itself as a doer, it does not need to defend its position. Because it does not reify the other as an object, it does not reduce beings to functions or categories. Each encounter is unique, and in that uniqueness, the appropriate response appears. In the field of global transmission, this ethical sensitivity becomes especially important. The The speed and reach of contemporary media allow forms to appear everywhere at once. Words, images, and teachings move across cultures and contexts without the gradual process of integration that once accompanied their transmission. In such a field, it is easy for the display to be appropriated, misunderstood, or used in ways that reinforce separation rather than dissolve it. The recognition of Rang Snang does not mean that all uses of form are equal in their effect. A form that points toward awakening functions as upāya. A form that strengthens fixation functions as obscuration. Both are empty in their nature, but their functioning within the relative field differs. Ethics is the clarity that perceives this difference without falling back into reification. This clarity expresses itself in several ways. There is respect for the sources from which forms arise, not because those sources possess inherent authority, but because gratitude is the natural response to the recognition of interdependence. There is care in the use of symbols and teachings, not because they are fragile objects that must be protected, but because they are living gateways whose functioning can be distorted by unconscious handling. There is honesty in presentation, not as a moral obligation imposed from outside, but as the simple alignment of expression with actuality. Perhaps most importantly, there is the refusal to turn the Dharma into an identity. The moment the teaching becomes a means of establishing oneself as teacher, practitioner, lineage holder, innovator, or critic, reification has returned in subtle form. Ethics at the level of the unborn is the continuous dissolution of this movement. It is the transparency through which the teaching can appear without being captured. In the contemporary world, another dimension of this ethics becomes visible. The tools that allow the Dharma to reach vast numbers of beings also allow the amplification of confusion. Attention itself becomes a form of currency. Visibility becomes a form of power. In such an environment, the Bodhi-Child must remain rooted in the ground rather than in the metrics of appearance. The value of an expression is not measured by its reach, but by its capacity to liberate. This does not lead to withdrawal. It leads to a different mode of participation. One uses the tools fully, but without being used by them. One allows the teaching to circulate, but without becoming dependent on recognition. One accepts the responses that arise: praise, criticism, misunderstanding, indifference, without constructing a self from them. In this way, ethics becomes the natural fragrance of realization. It is not codified in advance, yet it is unmistakable. It appears as gentleness, as precision in speech, as the capacity to listen, as the refusal to exploit, as the willingness to remain invisible when invisibility serves the situation, and to become visible when visibility is required. It appears as the seamless alignment of wisdom and compassion. To act without reification is to move within the world as a field of relationship rather than as a collection of objects. Every form is encountered as a doorway. Every being is encountered as oneself in another configuration. The question, "What should I do?" is replaced by the direct perception of what is needed. Thus, the ethics of appearance without reification is not a system. It is the spontaneous order of the unborn functioning through a human life. It is the expression of emptiness as care. It is the recognition that because nothing possesses inherent existence, everything is infinitely precious. In this recognition, action becomes transparent. Form becomes responsibility. Freedom becomes compassion. Chapter 9. The Luminous Equality of All Media. When the ground is recognized as the source and substance of every appearance, and when the illusion of authorship and the fixation on method have fallen away, a final hierarchy begins to dissolve the hierarchy of media. What once seemed to be higher and lower forms of transmission, more sacred and less sacred vehicles of the Dharma, are revealed as equal in their essence. This is not a cultural adjustment or a modern concession. It is the natural consequence of seeing that all forms are the radiance of the same unborn clarity. In earlier periods, it was possible to imagine that certain materials carried a closer proximity to realization. The hand-copied sutra, the temple bell, the carved statue, the presence of the teacher in the same physical space, these appeared to possess a density of sacredness that other forms lacked. This perception arose not because these forms were inherently closer to the real, but because the recognition of their nature was more easily supported by the conditions in which they appeared. The environment itself reinforced recollection. In the contemporary world, the range of media has expanded beyond anything known in previous centuries. The teaching appears as sound without a visible speaker, as text without a physical page, as image composed entirely of light, as presence carried through networks that have no location in ordinary space. For some, this proliferation creates the impression of dilution. The question arises, can what is weightless carry what is ultimate? This question rests upon a misunderstanding. The weight of a form has never been the measure of its capacity to reveal the real. A spoken word vanishes the moment it is uttered, yet it has opened the gate for countless practitioners. A single gesture of a Zen master, seen once and never repeated, has cut through lifetimes of confusion. The form is not the source of its power, its transparency to the ground is. When transparency is complete, every medium becomes a perfect vehicle. The printed page and the digital screen are equal. The recorded voice and the living voice are equal. The temple hall and the solitary room are equal. The painted mandala and the image composed of pixels are equal. None possesses inherent sanctity. None is excluded from functioning as upāya. This equality does not erase difference. Each medium has its particular mode of appearance. The physical presence of a teacher carries a density of relational immediacy. The written word allows for contemplation across time. The digital transmission reaches those who would otherwise remain untouched by the teaching. These differences are not hierarchical, they are functional. They are the diverse gestures of a single activity responding to diverse conditions. The recognition of luminous equality frees the practitioner from both attachment and aversion. One no longer clings to traditional forms as the only valid containers of the Dharma, nor does one become fascinated with the new simply because it is new. One uses what appears, in the way it appears, for the sake of awakening. The question is never which medium is superior. The question is whether the medium is transparent to its source. This has profound implications for the contemporary field of transmission. It means that the Dharma can move through the entire spectrum of human communication without losing its essence. A teaching offered through a global network is not a diminished reflection of a more authentic encounter. It is the authentic encounter appearing in a different mode. The same recognition occurs. The same freedom is revealed. At the same time, luminous equality protects the tradition from the unconscious absolutizing of new forms. The digital image is not inherently more accessible to the real than the ancient icon. The global broadcast is not inherently more compassionate than the intimate conversation. Each becomes what it is through the clarity with which it is employed. Equality prevents the creation of a new hierarchy in place of the old. This understanding also reveals that the true medium of the Dharma has never been external. The real medium is awareness itself. All forms, sound, text, image, gesture, presence, appear within this medium and dissolve within it. The effectiveness of any vehicle depends upon the degree to which it returns the practitioner to this primary field. When the attention is drawn back to the knowing in which the form appears, the medium has fulfilled its function. From this perspective, the entire world becomes a field of transmission. The movement of clouds across the sky, the rhythm of urban traffic, the glow of a screen in the night, the silence of a retreat hall, all are equal as expressions of the same luminosity. None are distractions in themselves. None are inherently sacred. Their function is determined by the recognition that encounters them. For the Bodhi-Child, this equality is lived without deliberation. The choice of medium is simply the response to the situation. A written text appears where reflection is needed. A spoken teaching appears where the immediacy of voice is required. An image appears where direct conceptual understanding would be too slow. Silence appears where all forms would obscure. There is no preference because there is no identity to be confirmed by the use of one form rather than another. This is the final liberation of skillful means. When all media are seen as the play of the same ground, there is nothing left to defend and nothing left to reject. The Dharma becomes indestructible because it is no longer confined to any particular expression. Even if every book were lost, every temple destroyed, every network silenced, the transmission would continue in the simple fact of awareness recognizing itself. Luminous equality is therefore not an aesthetic position. It is the direct perception of the non-dual nature of form. It is the recognition that the real has never been absent from any appearance, and that every appearance is capable of revealing it. In this recognition, the ancient and the contemporary meet without conflict. The sacred and the ordinary are no longer two. The medium and the message dissolve into a single radiance. Whatever appears is the Dharma. Whatever reveals this is the perfect vehicle. Chapter 10. The Future Field of Bodhi-activity. When the equality of all media has been recognized and the circulation of dana has been seen as the natural support of the teaching, the question of the future no longer appears as a projection of hope or fear. It appears as the open dimension of the present, the yet unfolding movement of the unborn within conditions that have not fully taken shape. The future is not a distant time. It is the dynamic aspect of this moment. To speak of the future field of Bodhi-activity is therefore not to speculate about what will happen, but to recognize how awakening functions when it is no longer bound to the forms of the past. Throughout the history of the Dharma, each transformation in the mode of transmission has seemed, to those living within it, both a danger and a promise. The movement from oral teaching to written text, from manuscript to printed page, from physical proximity to recorded voice, each was experienced as a threshold. Yet in every case, the essence of the transmission remained unchanged. The ground did not become more or less present, only the range of its display expanded. In the present age, the expansion has reached a scale that reveals something unprecedented, the near instantaneous interconnection of beings across the entire planet. A word spoken in one place appears in countless others at the same moment. A text composed in solitude enters the awareness of readers in many cultures simultaneously. A single image becomes a shared point of contemplation for a global field. For the first time in human history, the conditions exist for the Dharma to manifest as a truly planetary activity. This does not mean that awakening becomes collective in the sense of a mass event. Recognition is always intimate, always immediate, always without distance. But the field in which that recognition can appear has widened beyond all previous limitation. The Bodhi-Child now moves in an environment where the separation between teacher and listener, center and periphery, tradition and innovation has become permeable. The mandala of transmission is no longer localized, it is spherical. In such a field, the meaning of presence changes. Physical proximity is no longer the sole mode through which the living activity of realization is encountered. Presence appears as resonance. One may sit alone in a room and enter the same field of recognition that is being articulated simultaneously in another part of the world. This is not a lesser form of contact. It is the demonstration that the true place of meeting has never been physical. The future field of Bodhi-activity therefore unfolds along two inseparable dimensions. The first is the increasing subtlety of the media through which the teaching appears. Forms become lighter, more immediate, less dependent on material structure. The second is the deepening responsibility of those through whom the teaching moves. As the reach expands, the necessity for clarity becomes absolute. There is less and less support from fixed institutions and more reliance on direct realization. In this environment, the Bodhi-Child cannot depend on inherited forms for authority. Authority is the authenticity of presence. The teaching is recognized not because it is certified by tradition, but because it carries the unmistakable mark of the unborn. This does not diminish lineage, it fulfills it. The true lineage is the continuity of recognition, not the preservation of external structure. The global field also brings into visibility the interdependence of all beings in a new way. Suffering that once remained hidden within a particular region becomes immediately known across the world. Joy, creativity, confusion, and awakening circulate with equal speed. Compassion can no longer remain abstract. The Bodhi-Child encounters the reality of the human condition in its totality. The response to this encounter cannot be ideological. It must arise from the direct perception of non-separation. This gives Bodhi-activity a new character. It is no longer confined to explicitly religious contexts. It appears wherever the reduction of suffering and the unveiling of clarity occur. It moves through education, through art, through dialogue, through silent presence within environments that would never name themselves as spiritual. The distinction between Dharma activity and ordinary activity dissolves completely. At the same time, the future field requires a profound stability. The speed and intensity of contemporary life can easily fragment attention and disperse energy. The Bodhi-Child must therefore remain rooted in the unmoving ground while functioning in a world of continuous movement. This is the union of stillness and activity that the great traditions have always described. Without this rooting, the very media that allow the teaching to spread can become currents that carry the practitioner into distraction. Thus, the future of the Dharma is not a matter of expansion alone, it is a matter of depth. The more widely the teaching appears, the more essential it becomes that it arise from direct realization rather than from conceptual repetition. In this way, the global field becomes a crucible. It reveals with great clarity the difference between expression that originates in the unborn and expression that originates in the self. What then is the form of Bodhi-activity in such a world? It has no single form. It is the capacity to meet each situation with the exact expression that liberates. It is the willingness to remain invisible when visibility would create fixation, and to become visible when visibility serves awakening. It is the ability to move through all media without being defined by any. It is the continuous offering of the teaching without the need to establish a position. In this movement, the ancient image of the Bodhisattva returning to the world after realization finds its contemporary meaning. The return is no longer to a particular village or kingdom. It is to the entire network of human experience. The vow to liberate all beings is no longer a symbolic statement. It becomes the natural orientation within a field in which all beings are immediately present to one another. The future field of Bodhi-activity is therefore not a new era in the chronological sense. It is the unveiling of what has always been true, that awakening is not bound by time, place, or form. What is new is the scale at which this truth can be expressed. In this field, the Dharma is indestructible. It does not depend on the survival of any single institution, culture, or medium. It appears wherever there is awareness. It functions wherever there is suffering. It is recognized wherever there is the slightest opening. The Bodhi-Child moves in this field without center and without boundary. The activity is endless because it has never begun. The future is the radiance of the unborn. The transmission is already complete. Closing. The return that never departed. When a series comes to its end, the habitual mind imagines that something has been completed. A path has been traced, themes have been explored, and a conclusion is expected. But what has been entered here has never moved in a straight line. It has unfolded as a mandala, every point returning to the center, every movement revealing what was already present. From the first question concerning a single image to the vast field of planetary transmission, nothing new has been added to the unborn. What has occurred is the gradual removal of the assumption that the Dharma depends upon particular forms for its survival. Again and again, we have seen that what appears to be a challenge to the teaching becomes, when entered without grasping, a revelation of its indestructible nature. Skillful means has been revealed not as a collection of methods, but as the spontaneous activity of awakening itself. Self-arising display has been seen not as a metaphysical doctrine, but as the immediate fact of every perception. The poverty of instruments has freed us from dependence upon any medium, even as it has allowed all media to function. The history of transmission has shown itself to be the continuous creativity of compassion. The illusion of authorship has dissolved into the seamless movement of expression without a possessor. The Bodhi-Child has appeared as the natural responsiveness of realization within conditions. Dana has been recognized as the circulation of support within a field that cannot be owned. Ethics has emerged as the fragrance of non-reification. The equality of all media has restored the world itself as the body of the Dharma. The future has been revealed as the open dimension of the present. Each of these insights is a gate. None of them stands apart from the others. Together they form a single seeing. There has never been a distance between the ground and its display. The anxiety of the contemporary world arises from the belief that something essential can be lost, that authenticity can be diluted, that presence can be replaced, that the sacred can be displaced by the technological, that realization can be obscured by the proliferation of forms. This series has been an extended contemplation of that anxiety, not to dismiss it, but to look directly into its source. What is discovered is simple. The Dharma does not survive because it is preserved. It appears because it cannot disappear. The unborn has never depended upon temples, scriptures, teachers, institutions, or media. All of these have been its expressions. When they change, it has not changed. When they vanish, it has not vanished. When new forms arise, it is those forms. To see this is to be released from both nostalgia and anticipation. The past no longer holds the measure of authenticity. The future no longer holds the promise of completion. The present moment, exactly as it is, becomes the complete field of transmission. This does not diminish the value of form. On the contrary, it restores its sacredness. When nothing is required for realization, everything becomes available for its expression. The written word, the spoken teaching, the digital image, the silent presence, each is equally the activity of the ground. The question is never which is highest. The question is whether it is transparent. The black dragon eye mandala has accompanied this entire unfolding as the visual seal of that transparency. The depthless pupil has remained unchanged, while the radiance of the iris has taken on countless patterns. Each chapter has been a movement within that radiance. Now the movement returns to the center, not as a final point, but as the recognition that there has never been a circumference. For the Bodhi-Child, this return is the beginning of activity. Nothing has been concluded. The world remains exactly as it is, filled with beings who experience separation, filled with forms that can function as gates, filled with conditions that call forth compassion. The global field continues to unfold. New media will appear. New questions will arise. The same koan will take on new language. The response will not come from a system. It will come from the same source that has moved through this entire series. Thus, the closing is not a withdrawal. It is an opening. The teaching continues wherever these words are read. It continues wherever they are forgotten. It continues in the sound of a voice, in the glow of a screen, in the movement of a hand, in the silence between thoughts. It continues because it has never begun. If there is a seal to this series, it is this: nothing has been established. Nothing has been defended. Nothing has been resolved. The unborn has simply revealed itself as the activity of this very moment. The mandala remains open. The transmission is unceasing. The Bodhi-Child is already moving.